online Bible study. Whether you're tuning in at Twitter or Periscope at BibleStudyCam, whether you're on Facebook.com/reflective Bible study, whether you're on YouTube at The Online Preacher, or even at the onlinepreacher.com/live, wherever you happen to be tuning in, whether this is on live or on replay, whether it's one of those places or somewhere else, I want to welcome you to this morning's Bible study. And this morning we'll do a part one of a two-part little morning Bible studies focused in on a passage we discover in Luke. And this passage has a similar passage that's found in Matthew, but Matthew's passage is looked at a lot more, or it's a lot more commonly looked at, or it's a little bit more famous, whereas Luke's passage is powerful. But the first part of Luke's passage is almost always overlooked, and I hesitated to just do this as a one-part thing, but I felt as though I would be overlooking this first little section because the second section is really powerful and it's easier to focus on. But within the first section of this passage, we discover an amazing idea and something that might not have even happened had it not been for Jesus doing something earlier in his ministry that might not make a lot of sense. So with that said, let's dive into this passage and uncover what Jesus did, what happened here, and what we can learn for our lives today. This is Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 17, and I'm going to read from the New American Standard Bible. Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place, and there was a large crowd of his disciples, and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured. Verse 19, and all the people were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. Now, it would be really easy to just continue reading or to just skim right over this verse 19. And all the people were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. But what's amazing in my mind when I read this verse is that it echoes back to an almost secret miracle that seemed to have ignited a wave, you could say, of miracles, of people simply wanting to touch Jesus. Now, the almost secret miracle I'm referring to is earlier in the Gospels, while Jesus is hurrying to try to save Jairus' daughter, which Jairus was one of the synagogue leaders in one of the towns in Judea. While Jesus was racing to try to save this little girl before she died, a woman who had been suffering from a bleeding condition, she was a little bit, I presume she was a little bit embarrassed about this, her condition, but she wanted healing and she believed that Jesus could heal her. And so she squeezes her way through the crowd as Jesus is hurrying, and she just manages to touch the edge of his garment. And then she feels as though once she's touched the edge of his garment, she's healed and then she can go away. But the instant that happened, Jesus stops everything because he felt power go out from him. And he, against everyone else who was present, against all of their desires, because they all believed Jesus needed to hurry to this synagogue leader's house to heal his daughter before she died, Jesus stops. The woman, she was trying to do this miracle in secret. Jairus was interested in Jesus hurrying to save his daughter, and the disciples and everyone thought that Jesus was a little bit crazy for stopping everything because somebody touched him. But Jesus stopped and drew that miracle out into the spotlight and gave that woman some of the greatest or an amazing compliment because of her faith. And it's amazing because after that event, there's a handful of other places, this one included, where we see people simply wanting to touch Jesus to be healed. And it's interesting in my mind because my imagination asks the question, if Jesus had not drew this woman's miracle into the spotlight, would there be a whole crowd or a whole huge group of people that would simply be interested in touching Jesus to be healed? Not desiring Jesus' time or attention or anything like that, just simply coming up and touching the edge of his clothing. And that's amazing in my mind because I have a suspicion that a lot of these follow-up miracles, like is what's described here in verse 19, and all the people were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. I believe that this verse here draws our attention onto the power of this woman's testimony and how she was healed simply by touching Jesus. But then where does that leave us today? Now, in my own life, when I hear or think about Jesus and the idea of touching, I immediately think about the idea of Jesus or God wanting him to touch my life, wanting him to use my life for his glory. And that's not a bad thing. But what's interesting is, what if in our own lives today, in the world today, we were interested in touching God or touching Jesus, touching in focusing in on what we could do to actively touch Jesus. Now, it's perhaps not as easy today as it was back when Jesus was physically walking around in the world, but I believe that Jesus has opened or left a way open that we can actively touch him. If you're wondering where that thought came from or how to walk through that door, I believe that in one of Jesus's parables, it's a challenging parable, but he finishes this parable off with the phrase, "Whatever you have done for the least of these, you have done it to me." And so, in an interesting sort of twist, when we are interested or focused on touching Jesus, on seeing miracles in our own lives, on being ambassadors and disciples for Jesus in the world today, the best way we can do this is by seeking to help and bless the least of these, the lowest in society, the most looked down on in society. And on one hand, this is an important goal. But where society today, at least in my own opinion, gets this amazing altruistic concept wrong, is that we don't look down and bless the least of these by looking down. That's one angle of it. We have to step down just like Jesus did to help lift them up. That's one thing. But the other thing is that we don't bless the least of these and lift them up by putting other people down. If there's somebody at the top, it doesn't do anybody any good to tear the person at the top down in order to try to make the other person feel a little bit lifted up, because that actually doesn't lift the other person up. It just makes there being a lot of people at the bottom. But instead, seeking to touch Jesus, as I see alluded here, is being like Jesus and stepping down and helping the least of these. Helping whoever would be interested in help and asking what they need. Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't know, but being there and being a blessing. So that's what I wanted to draw our attention to, because while it would be very easy to just keep on reading, this couple verses here is the opening to Jesus's Sermon on the Plain is what it's called. The plain being the flat level place, and this is to contrast Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that's found in Matthew's Gospel. But while it would be really easy to jump into Jesus' teaching, I wanted to focus our attention onto this opening, because in this opening, we see hinted at the way to touch Jesus and the way to experience miracles in our own lives. So thank you for tuning in, whether you're tuning in on Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or Periscope or wherever you happen to be. Thank you for tuning in. And if I shared something in this message that you feel would be encouraging or helpful or a blessing or challenging or inspirational to someone you know, I would encourage you to share this video with them. And if I missed sharing something in this passage that you want to draw my attention to, then jump into any one of the places where you have a comment box, whether it's on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or even Periscope. I watch and I look at all of those, but with Periscope, I don't think I'll be able to respond as quickly, or I might not be able to respond, because when this live stream ends, Periscope's live stream or the chat area will end. But I do read all of the comments that comes in, and periodically throughout today I will jump in and respond where needed if you have a question, and let's just keep this conversation going. And together, while we are separated because of distance and because of social distancing and because of all the craziness in the world today, let's stay connected digitally and keep our hearts and our minds and our eyes and our perspectives focused on Jesus. And so with that said, stay tuned. We're going to pick back up right where we left off tomorrow morning and look at the first portion of this lesser known sermon that Jesus shared and unpack something that is relevant for our lives today. Or I guess I should say relevant for our lives tomorrow, which would then be today when we look at it tomorrow. But I digress. I'll see you tomorrow.